Hello everyone, this is Sammy from Health and Vitality, and today we have a very special guest with us, Tony Wright, the author of Left in the Dark, which is set for a relaunch later this year called Return to the Brain of Eden. Hello Tony, nice to have you with us today.
Hello, Sammy. How are you?
I am fine. How are you today?
Yep, pretty good, pretty good.
So tell us a little bit about your background and upbringing. What led you to this whole concept of human symbiosis with fruit then?
Nice, easy one to start with. It depends how far I go back, I suppose. Yeah, I really grew up in a very kind of normal way, whatever that means. I didn't have any grand plans to go looking into the human condition or our evolution or our origins and so on. But I ended up studying plants and some plant sciences, and I guess that's where things started to come together a little bit. And I sort of had a little bit of a background in fairly orthodox ideas on, I guess, evolution and the standard ideas around evolution, and I was quite a skeptical state of mind when it came to anything that really wasn't scientific in the very orthodox way. But I bumped into one or two people, and they were interested in things that seemed a little bit unusual to me. Sort of what you might call spiritual or shamanic ideas, this kind of thing. And around that time, I also came across some information. I was given some information basically on human diet, what humans eat, that was making statements along the lines of it was pretty crazy what we were doing, the things we were eating were totally unnatural, and it just had never occurred to me. Like, I guess most people, you grow up, you eat what you eat, and you don't really think about it too much. So that kind of got me interested, and with my little bit of background in plant sciences, I could see quite quickly that actually what was being said seemed to make some sense. It was like, okay, how does this make sense? How we ended up eating these very strange materials that most of us are brought up to be called food, and it's normal, although of course every culture is different, so there's many different versions. So that was kind of the start, and I guess I've got quite a curious nature, so I made a decision after 2 or 3 months of finding this whole diet thing interesting. Okay, well, what do primates eat? What's a rough idea of a primate diet? And I basically switched to eating as much raw food as I could. This was about 1991. Just to see what would happen. I didn't have any plans to keep doing that forever. I just thought, well, I'll try it for a few months and see how I get on. And it was fascinating. All the kind of things that a lot of people experience when they make big changes to their diet. Not all of them particularly easy, sometimes quite challenging. But within 2 or 3 years, I noticed some subtle but quite clear changes in my state of mind, my thinking, and just general sense of beingness. And that really started to create more curiosity about these other ideas I'd been hearing about from different people. This sort of idea that we have more to us than perhaps what we normally experience. So really that was just where the ideas were starting to come together. And again, having this kind of curious nature, I began looking into other things I could experiment with, not just diet, but what other things I could bring together and see what happens. See what happens when you play around with the operating environment of your consciousness system, because I guess we're all in charge of that, even if we grow up thinking that's fixed and everything else is around that. But actually the very equipment we use or the very equipment that plays a big role in giving us a sense of who we are and what we are, actually is very very easy to change those specifications. So that's what I began doing, really looking at sort of some of the ancient spiritual and shamanic approaches and combining them with a raw food diet. And I guess, as I say, that's about 20 years ago, and the kind of experiences that started to emerge turned my curiosity into, I guess, a little bit of an obsession, and I just became incredibly interested in how it all worked, why different pieces or different traditions tried different approaches, and so on and so forth. So that was really the beginning of it, and slowly I kind of became aware that I was really investigating questions that many people had been investigating for the whole of human history. So I was clearly not trying to do anything new, but I was interested to see how I could put all these pieces together and maybe come up with something that makes sense. So that was the start of it.
Right. How did you end up going to the whole sleep deprivation episode, and what you got out of it? What was your experience on the aftermath of that?
Yeah, sleep deprivation. I think I forever I'll be known as the guy who did that sleep deprivation thing, which I guess is fair enough. But yes, I mean, it again, quite early on, when I started reading, a lot of material, not huge amounts from each particular tradition, but summaries of different ideas and traditions. And quite early on, I came across this idea that, I suppose the basic idea is that there's a latent or a different sense of self that resides in us all, but is difficult to experience. That was the kind of basic idea, which again is nothing new in that's embedded in so many traditions. So I was looking for techniques and practices that were claimed to allow access to allow some kind of change. And quite early on, I came across information that talked about sleep, and actually reducing sleep, or even eliminating sleep, stopping sleeping altogether for quite long periods, anything up to maybe about 7 days, was supposed to open up these doors, open up a window into a different experience. And of course, I'd got my curiosity, and I thought, well, actually, it's not a restricted practice. There's no law against staying awake. And at the time I was interested in this information, I'd been eating a primarily raw diet for about 3 years, and I thought, well, that might be an interesting combination, because obviously most people's experience, including my own, of when you stay awake, you get tired, you get irritable, you become clumsy, your balance and coordination goes, your speech can become slurred, and so on, and it feels pretty goddamn awful, which is what most people experience. So, well, this might be an interesting combination. Raw food, which, of course, another way of looking at raw food, it's like it's like molecular engineering. It's like you're building your construction materials and your fuel. Well, I'd made significant changes in those for about 3 years. So I thought, well, this might be interesting. So really, I just started doing some experiments of staying awake, initially 2 or 3 days at a time, and anything up to this period of about a week, which cropped up in a couple of traditions. I think it's implied in the Buddhist tradition that the Buddha reached some altered state, some state of enlightenment after meditating for 7 days. And of course, meditation by default is a form of staying awake, if presuming you're not falling asleep. And it's also quite a clear reference, whether it's supposed to be a metaphor or quite literal, who knows, but in one of the very earliest texts that we know, the Epic of Gilgamesh, I think it's a sort of Sumerian tradition, or at least that's what's presumed and found on these clay tablets, and it talks about it's like a classic quest, I suppose, and the initiate is given various tasks to do, and one of the tasks towards the end is to stay awake for 7 days and 7 nights. The idea being that these approaches will regain access to the lost state of consciousness of the ancestors. So I had these kind of rough reference points, these rough ideas. I mean, I really didn't know what I was doing. It was just, oh well, let's try it and see what happens. And my early experiences, maybe they were lucky, maybe I got lucky quite early on, but I had some quite extraordinary experiences, things that I would never have expected in a million years. And of course, having those experiences quite early on, it further fueled my obsession. It's like, oh my God, there's something in this, bearing in mind that I'd grown up pretty straight, very skeptical. So I was hooked. I thought, oh my God, there's something really going on here. What on earth is it? So that's going back to, again, maybe 1994 and 5. I was beginning those kind of experiments, and generally, it was a period of incredible fascination. Certainly, periods of epic failure, trying to stay awake, particularly on your own. It always sounds a really good idea when you've woken up and you've had 6 or 8 hours sleep. You think, yeah, great, I'm going to stay awake for 3 days. By about 48 hours, it's a terrible idea, and you do anything to stop it, and of course, it's very easy to lose focus. You just need to sit down for 10 seconds and forget what you're doing, and next thing you wake up, a few hours later feeling dreadful. So that was a repeating pattern, but within that, every now and again, something quite bizarre or magical would happen, and that was what fueled the fire of curiosity. And without going into too much detail, there were classic and often described states that people do access, whether it's through meditation or yoga or shamanic traditional approaches and so on. The sleep deprivation alone, in combination with the diet, certainly was enough to get glimpses. I'm not claiming anything else, but there were glimpses of states that were, well, they were the kind of states that if you could press a button, you'd stay in that state forever and you'd never want to leave it. So it's pretty amazing, but certainly not an easy approach. Certainly not, oh my God, you just stay awake for a couple of days and that's it. It was transient. The states never lasted very long. But they provided a framework. I thought, well, okay, what else can you put into the mix, and how else does this all fit together? And I kind of continued those experiments on and off for a good few years at different periods, including I managed to persuade a university in the UK to run some tests, because in reading about sleep deprivation, and of course I'm sure it's quite correct that when you're deprived of sleep, you can become deluded and hallucinate things that aren't really there, and so on and so forth. And what I'd noticed, amongst many other things, was a physical sense of improvement. I felt as if I had more stamina, I had more strength and better balance, and I'm normally right-handed. Well, during these periods of sleep deprivation, particularly if it was more than 2 days, I began to notice that I could use my left hand as well as my right. So I thought, well, okay, the things that happen that are what you might call state of mind or perception, how do you measure that? It's a little bit tricky. Of course, it's possible, but these physical changes, either I'm deluded or they must be real. So I managed to get, again, this university to run some tests, and I did a 5-day experiment there. And sure enough, I'd gone along and tried to convince them to run these experiments. They thought I was crazy, obviously, and they didn't want to let me do too many days in case I died or something unpleasant like that. And the guy running the experiments, or overseeing the experiments, the professor at the university at the time, he was ex-military, and he'd actually done training to cope with sleep deprivation as part of the kind of military approach to being in the field and so on. So he was interested. He thought, he was pretty convinced that I'd find out that I was kidding myself, that I was deluded, that actually while I was thinking I was feeling fine, I would be a complete mess. So it was an interesting experiment, and I sort of said, well, look, if I stay the same, if I can turn up, you run a battery of tests, and at the end of 5 days I'm still doing the same level of proficiency, that would be interesting, because all the standard theory is that your ability declines, you get pretty bad at everything. But actually what happened for the most part, and particularly in the areas that they were testing, so balance, dexterity, coordination, and so on, all of those things improved. And they were quite perplexed by this, and really I was hoping the study would be published. There was talk of it being published, but because they couldn't explain the results, they said, well, look, really, we have to run this again, which I was in favor of. I said, well, that's fine. But they had no funding. There was no funding to do more tests, so that was the only time it was ever done. But it was an interesting experiment. I do have some data from it. Some of it's on websites, some of it's published in the book. And as far as I'm aware, it's one of the few experiments where humans, and if you buy into the idea that we're primates, so a human built from and running on something closer to our original diet. I'm not saying it was exactly the same, but at least something closer, then running a battery of tests. A bit like if you're going to test a car or an aeroplane, it would be sensible to use the original specifications. If you're testing it with really poor quality fuel or poor quality components, you're not going to get true results. So I thought, well, all the studies that science currently does are based on this idea that what we currently build ourselves from is correct, even though the anthropologists, the primatologists, and the pharmacologists and the molecular biologists would agree that in the past we would have been constructed from something completely different. So fascinating time. Got some interesting results. Unfortunately, it couldn't progress any further. I didn't have the funds or the resources, but it certainly convinced me that there was something about human sleep in our current state that isn't all we sort of understand it to be. And all the current tests, of course, don't take this into account. And then moving on, I guess, where a lot of people do ask me about sleep. All this time, I was trying to build this wider theory, trying to look at this wider picture, and trying to make sense of all these traditions that were talking about humans going into slow decline, becoming more deluded, and so on, and these various practices which I began to look at as if they were treating a condition. Well, if there's a condition here, what is the condition? What's its nature? And can the treatments tell us anything about the condition? Like, can they offer a sort of diagnosis? So trying to piece all these things together, and quite early on came up with this idea, having looked at the neurological research, particularly the left and right brain data and material, which has been well written about for at least 40 years and is often dismissed as too simplistic. But something struck me there, that really maybe we'd missed something screamingly obvious, like a kind of a catch-22. And when I looked at the information, and based on some of my early experiences, I thought, well, there's all this information talking about the left side of our brain. It's perceptually dominant. It gives us our major sense of who we are most of the time. And all this information talked about what appeared to be unusual abilities or specialized abilities, but they included things like delusion and denial and a sort of constant inability to see reality, constantly lying. So all these things were in the literature, that the part of our brain that was usually in charge had all these weird and unusual traits. I thought, well, this is bizarre, because if it's in charge, it's the one then coming up with the conclusions. We're running these experiments. The left side of our brain's in charge. It's looking at the data and going, oh yes, these are specialized abilities. The left brain's very advanced, has all these specialized abilities, not quite sure what the right brain's up to. It's got all these kind of creative and emotional things and so on. But I immediately thought, well, isn't there something really simple here that we've missed? It's like self-assessment when you're potentially mentally unwell. It's not very safe to do that. Is it possible the left brain is just giving itself a clean bill of health and it doesn't want to hear anything else? Because that's what the data is saying. That's what the information was saying. So I had all these pieces put together, But having no resources, not being in the academic system in any significant way, I thought, how can I sort of draw some interest into this? And having written a manuscript and sort of put it together in a self-published package, I thought it might be interesting to put on a bit of a publicity exercise. And having done a lot of sleep deprivation and knowing the sort of challenges that brings, and also because I was eating in a certain way and had by that time, it was getting up for 15, 20 years at the time I did the publicity event, I actually found it a lot easier than most people do. And I think that was down to the diet, down to eating, a raw diet. So I tried to put on a major event in London with sponsorship and so on, and it almost came together, but eventually the potential sponsors, they got cold feet. They were afraid that I'd go completely crazy or I'd die again, a little bit like the university. So they backed out, and it didn't happen. So I ended up going to a very small bar, a public house in the town that I was living at the time. Not exactly ideal in many ways, but I knew the guy who owned the place, and I said, look, I'm thinking of doing this publicity event. I'm hoping to kind of draw a little bit of media attention to my research, into my book and so on. Would you be interested in hosting it? And I think he'd had a couple of drinks at the time, and he sort of said, oh yeah, that'll be fine, Probably thought I was just having a joke. But anyway, I arranged all this thing, and we got some CCTV set up, some cameras set up, and I tried to inform a few of the local media, the local paper, which is quite a small paper, and local BBC. And I said, well, I'm going to try and break a very old record. It's not the only record. I knew that at the time, but it was a record that was well documented, and it was still, documents still exist online today. And the guy who set the record, when sleep deprivation records were quite a trendy thing to do, I guess, he was 17 at the time, and I was in my 40s at the time. And he clearly struggled from about the second day onwards. He had a hell of a time. He was almost having to be carried around to keep him awake. And I thought, well, I know I can do a lot better than that. I will have some periods of tiredness, but I know I'll have long periods where I'm pretty functional. And I thought, well, that might be unusual as a media event, and hopefully might, draw in more questions. And his record that he set in 1964 was 11 days. Which is quite a long time, and I'd never done 11 days. I'd done about 7 or 8 days before, and I thought, well, I'll give it a go. So that's how it all started. So yeah, I ended up in a fairly small bar with people coming in every night and getting drunk and stuff, and I'm trying to do this sleep deprivation thing, and it was quite surreal. Not just because I was staying awake, but just the media did turn up initially. A little bit of local press, but within 2 or 3 days it snowballed, and oh my god, everybody turned up. And I actually found it quite daunting. I have to admit, I managed to create a publicity platform, and then I think I got stage fright. It was like, oh my god, this is too much. But yeah, that was how that all came about, and currently I think my reputation is still, I'm the guy who does that sleep thing kind of thing, which of course there's some truth in it, and I think there's some fascinating stuff about human sleep, but the real picture is much, much bigger than that. But yeah, that's how that all happened. That was in 2007. And it did draw some interest in, but unfortunately the media being what they are, they saw what they wanted to see, wrote what they wanted to write, and then everybody disappeared again pretty much.
Right. What sort of improvements and revelations you keep getting year after year the longer you eat a raw food diet and try to train yourself to be more right-brained in your activities? What sort of things you keep noticing over the years that keeps improving?
Well, that's a good question, because I kind of decided fairly early. Well, when I say fairly early on, I was very intensive in my experimentation for 2 or 3 years because it was such a fascinating time. So it was weeks and months back to back of doing all sorts of unusual experiments, shall we say, and absolutely fascinating experiences. But I came to the conclusion towards the end of the 1990s that actually, yes, I could spend forever doing this. I could disappear into the mountains and have a phenomenally interesting time. But I thought, if this is gonna have any relevance, I really need to find a way to put it into a language that can be understandable and be tested in some way, sort of almost accepting that the current paradigm is modern science. Whether it has flaws or not, that's not the point. It's a very, very powerful paradigm, and it influences modern Western culture greatly. So I thought, is there a way to pull this together and make a challenging and powerful argument that actually we're in serious trouble, which of course is exactly what all the ancient traditions said. So I decided that was my priority, and I sort of eased back quite a lot on the experimentation. I stuck with being raw, and I still dabbled from time to time, but I became much more focused on how to formulate, or how to put this in a formula that can be understood in a very rational way. So for the next, I guess, 10 years, that was my major focus, and in some ways it's remained that way. I haven't really been so focused on extreme experiments. Admittedly, I'd like to get back to some of those experiments because they are fascinating, and I was a little bit naive in terms of how long I thought this would take. I thought, okay, get this written up, get a publishing deal, and then maybe there'll be more resources to do more experiments. And that was really probably around about 2000 that all started. And here I am now, 14 years later, and still working through that whole process of getting publishing deals and getting the information into a format that people can understand. And it is coming together, but it's taking a lot longer. So anyway, to address your question, in those early days, I don't really want to start trying to put into words things that are very difficult to explain. Classic challenge of how do you explain things that really you have to experience. All I can say is that all the things that anybody's ever read about the sort of experiences that humans are clearly capable of under certain circumstances, sometimes spontaneously, but often in association with some kind of technique. And those techniques can range from the fairly mild, like I say, from say meditation, to perhaps the more powerful, so the sort of traditional use of plant medicines and so on and so forth. To me, all those things absolutely are real. How we can access them or how easy it is, that does vary a lot. So yes, some absolutely fascinating stuff. What I would say is continued to stay with me is a different way of looking at things. That's never really gone away. Sometimes it's more accessible, sometimes less so. But after maybe about 3 or 4 years of eating that way, and then beginning these approaches, combining these approaches, I began to find it much easier to see patterns in information that I would never have seen before, sort of being able to put pieces of information together that I would have just never considered putting in the same place. Now, of course, whether they mean anything, time will tell, but it certainly seems to be easier to see patterns in information that normally I wouldn't have seen at all, and I don't think other people see so easily either. And of course, this is reported by many other people. When you get into unusual or altered states of consciousness, you can see things differently. So yes, that has maintained itself. The more extraordinary experiences are very much related to applying certain approaches, and I choose for the most part not to do that for now. I'm much more focused on getting this basic idea out and initiating debate, and really, I suppose, trying to draw attention to these questions. Is there a serious problem with our consciousness system, with our perception? Is it actually staring us in the face and we're so deluded, like as if we've all got dementia, and how would we know if we've got dementia? It's no use going, well, I feel fine, therefore I'm fine. That self-assessment is no longer appropriate. So is it possible to set out relatively objective information? I mean, whether anything's truly objective, that's highly debatable, but let's say relatively objective, repeating patterns of data from all sorts of sources. Is it possible to lay it out in such a way that even to a deluded mind, it becomes apparent that there's something wrong here, and we've missed it because the very equipment we're using to look at the problem is the equipment that has the problem. So that's been my main focus, and I guess a lot less attention on the experimental approaches, at least for now. As I say, I did have rather naive expectations. I thought, yes, this will take 4 or 5 years, and it's taken well over 10 years to get to the point now where the information is clearly understandable by an increasing number of people. It's getting a lot of interest and some hostile reaction as well, of course, which I'd expect. And it's slowly getting more and more out there. That was the real challenge. How do you get this information out there? And without resources, it's very difficult. So, as you mentioned in the introduction, I've recently signed a publishing deal, and the book that was self-published is now going to be retitled and reframed a little bit, and hopefully will reach a much wider audience. So yeah, that's been my main focus. The experiences, yes, absolutely. All the things that you've ever read. Again, I don't want to just regurgitate the kind of experiences that we can all read about, or some people have certainly experienced. As far as I'm concerned, they're pretty much all available. It's simply a case of whether you can be bothered to access them or not. Our current neural configuration, our current consciousness state, generally, we don't access those things. Our normal state is very different from that. But there's clearly a number of things we can do, and it's entirely at our own choice, that will, by degrees, I think, virtually guarantee some form of very different state of being, which, when most people experience these states of being, they tend to use similar language. It's like, oh my God, it's like coming home. It feels more real than reality does, and so on and so on and so on. So I'd fully concur. I think those states exist. I only feel like I've had glimpses, but it's been enough to drive me for years and years. It's like, wow, there's something fundamental here. All these ancient traditions, some of them, or maybe all of them, have slowly become distorted over time, but the very essence that the human condition is now one of delusion, fear, paranoia, and very, very limited perception, I think is incredibly accurate. The challenge with that is we can all understand that concept, but that doesn't give us the sensory experience, and that's the tricky bit.
Right. What sort of factors do you see affecting the fact that some people get this fragmented access to these higher functions through just from birth, like eidetic or photographic memory and multidexterity and so forth?
I'd say very simplistically that the condition, as I call it, obviously I've got a lot of information out there now, but just to summarize it quickly, and it will sound like rehashed left-right brain stuff, and in many ways it is. I just think we've been looking at it from back to front. It's the information screaming at us. We're just using the wrong piece of kit to look at it. That's all. But basically, what I'm saying is we had at one time, going back quite a long time, an incredibly unique piece of equipment, a consciousness system, a neural system, a brain, whatever you want to call it, with phenomenal capacity compared to what we have now. And of course I'm not, and I say this in almost every interview, I'm not saying we are our brain, we are our neural system, but clearly it has a massive role in facilitating our sense of self. And that piece of equipment was incredibly unique at one time. And it's been degenerating. It's kind of regressed or reverted to a much more basic model, if you like. One side has regressed or reverted much more quickly than the other side, and that just happens to be the side that's currently in charge. So we're kind of running on the least functional side of our brain, and all the while it's claiming and it tells itself it's the most functional, while at the same time we're starved of the very biochemistry we need for this thing to work at all. So that's the essence of the diagnosis. And really, what I'm hoping to do with that is laid out in such a way that even our deluded rational mind can see this in a language it understands. This to me is a tricky bit. How can we come up with the language that, again, back to that analogy, if we've all got dementia, and let's say one day you wake up and you realize you've got dementia by some pure fluke or miracle or whatever, it's not enough to go, oh my God, I got dementia. Oh my God, we've all got dementia and we can fix it, because by definition, stating the obvious isn't going to make any difference. What's the language of dementia? How can you speak in language and reach somebody who's got dementia? Well, if the obvious thing is, of course, it's got to be rational left brain speak, because that's the language of dementia.
Right.
Sorry, I might not have answered your question there. By the way, I think I went off on a bit of a tangent. But ask me the question again, and I'll see if I can answer it this time.
Yeah. What factors do you see that come into play that make the differences that some people simply get this fragmented access to the higher functions simply from birth, that they have eidetic or photographic memory, or they're multidexterous, etc.?
Yeah. Okay, well now I tried to outline the condition a bit itself. So again, this left-right split, the left side quite retarded, the right side still huge capacity but locked away without the necessary build quality, the necessary fuels, the essential actually, it's chronically deficient. So basically that's the basic diagnosis, but the way these two systems interact is highly variable. I think despite what you sometimes read in popular culture, pretty much everybody, with almost no exceptions, is dominated by the left side of their brain, at least when it comes to their everyday sense of self. If you communicate like I am now, if you're speaking, that's left brain, and that's what most of us do. If you happen to sing everything in an operatic style, okay, that's interesting to me, but that doesn't happen very often. So really, to answer your question, I think it's just degrees of. Some people are much more locked into that very rational, absolute sense of certainty that, well, this is all there is, and I know that's all there is because that's all I can see. But again, that's back to self-assessment. Highly questionable if there's even the remotest chance there's a problem with our neural system. And then, of course, right across the spectrum, by degrees, people are aware there are problems. Some people are incredibly sensitive and find it very difficult to cope. And I think that same degree of balance or degree of asymmetry is reflected in the kind of access people have. So accessing some of those superlative skills, although I think they're probably still quite limited, is usually a sign of having more access to the right hemisphere, that's all. And often, especially in the case of some of the savant-like abilities, there's often quite tangible evidence of what might be considered even greater dysfunction in the left hemisphere. So there's often some of the skills that we think are normal becoming even more dysfunctional. But hand in hand with that, what I've proposed is that the ability of the rational mind, the left brain, to stay in charge also becomes weaker, and some of these other traits start to leak through. They're often quite fragmented, but phenomenally impressive. I think when you compare some of the abilities that humans display in those cases, they're not just a little bit better. They're not compensation. They're not, well, one system's broken, this is compensating. They're 10, 100, 1,000 times better. And it doesn't make any sense that we'd have these abilities locked away when clearly the wiring is there somewhere. Of course, hand in hand with being able to feel phenomenally amazing. I mean, why do humans have the capacity to feel astoundingly, wonderfully amazing, and yet it's quite tricky to have those experiences? What on earth is going on there? And why are we so content to put up with what is relatively incredibly depressed and mundane? What on earth are we doing? But yeah, I think to reiterate, that's the answer to that question. It's degrees of balance between the hemispheres, and also some other factors to do with specific kinds of damage that can occur to the left hemisphere, allowing access, particular birth sort of development environments. There's a lot of variation there, so I'd expect a spectrum, quite a wide spectrum of what might be called symptoms. Some people absolutely bulletproof, nailed down, utterly convinced that what they see is what there is. And then at the other extreme, a great awareness that there's a complete madness going on, and there's all sorts of things that some people just are blind to, and these traits go hand in hand with that. More creative, more access to these states. They tend to go hand in hand, not always, but most of the time.
Right, for sure. Do you see the whole matter of when humans started to migrate everywhere, that our breeding with Neanderthal and Denisovan, who were already in a long period of degeneration, that perhaps accelerated our own degeneration even further?
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and I think it's possible. I mean, in some ways, without sounding too harsh or judgmental, because I think humanity is in a terrible state, and I'm hardly the first person to come up with that conclusion. It's, again, another philosophical point. It's intriguing to me, at least, that throughout recorded history, some of the most intelligent and creative people, and of course currently as well, have been absolutely clear in their view that humanity is clinically insane. And they don't mean this as a joke. They don't mean this as some kind of metaphorical quip. They're deadly serious. And why on earth we're marching along the same path when incredibly intelligent people, and not just one or two, many people, and today, of course, many people feel the same way, have that view. You'd think if we were remotely sane, we'd immediately put the brakes on and go, okay, what's going on here? Of course, if we were completely insane, we'd just keep marching in the same direction. But anyway, that's digressing slightly. Back to the point with Neanderthals. I kind of use Neanderthals as an example of where we have been heading for some time. Neanderthals, it seems, fit the same primate pattern. That obviously, in the distant past, they were forest dwelling, and they ended up in quite harsh environments, and they survived. This isn't a question of survival necessarily, but no doubt lost all that forest biochemistry, that forest ecology, and I think degenerated in the same way we have been doing for perhaps a longer period of time. And again, it's not about survival. We are clever enough to survive. I'm talking about optimal function here. So any sort of crossbreeding, yes, it might have had the capacity, particularly in the maternal line, because I have a lot of interest in this sort of development in the uterus and the hormonal regime and the dietary regime and so on. So any meetings of different lineages of primates where one lineage had been degenerating for much longer, it could result in things not helping, shall we say. But genetically, the kind of basic genetics, I don't think that's really the problem, because I think so much of what we've lost isn't about a genetic loss. It's about the biochemistry. It's about how the genes were read, how the DNA was read. So yes, I think that it could have had a negative impact, but I think it's kind of, humans I think have been in trouble for a very long time. All the traditions, they don't say, yeah, things were fantastic till about 50 years ago or 500 years ago or 10,000 years ago. The traditions seem to imply ages of mankind, very long periods of time. And I concur. I think we've been in trouble for a long time. I think the condition is getting worse, and it's accelerating almost as we watch. But I think we've been in trouble for a long time. And I suspect the end of the expansion of our neocortex, the modern part of our brain, when that stopped expanding, it expanded at an incredible rate according to the information we have. When that expansion suddenly stopped, I think that's the smoking gun. Something changed then, and current evidence, of course, it may change, but that sort of puts it in the window of roughly 200,000 years ago when this phenomenal expansion suddenly stopped, and then there's been a slight shrinkage. So we're at the wrong end of a very long process. And I think our meetings with other primates came much later on and probably hasn't had a huge impact, to be honest.
Yeah, as a left brain counteract, what you say if if it was true that we have neurological degeneration for a long time, that what hope we today would have to hold and reverse this if our ancestors who were much more functional couldn't manage that.
Mm-hmm. That's a worrying question, and I think it's a very good question. Well, I think there is cause to be potentially optimistic anyway, particularly because I see this condition as being very asymmetric. It's like we have two systems now. I think at one time they were the same system, a phenomenal system, and it's because of this asymmetric reversion to type, we now have two systems, one severely dysfunctional that thinks it's amazing, and then one with much more function but locked away and starved of all the necessary components and so on. So I think we have the potential to make a fairly rapid shift to a much more functional state. I don't think that's the end of the journey, and I think where that could be achieved, where our ancestors, when I mean, you say they failed, and I'd agree, we wouldn't be having this conversation if they had succeeded. But I think they left some phenomenal clues if we can only interpret them correctly. I mean, one of the challenges I lay down is that if you step back, forget the dogma and the beliefs, and remember beliefs are very much left brain, and you step back from what all these traditions mean to us as individuals and our identity and so on, and in particular look at the practices and techniques, and of course possibly taking on board some of the traditions that these religious approaches were based on. And if you look at them as treatments, I would say that for the most part they fall into three simple categories. There's the basic engineering, the sort of molecular re-engineering. They call it, a week today call it diet and food. Completely stupid words for some of the most advanced molecular engineering that is in the known universe. You know, our neural system is incredibly, amazingly complex. And of course we're in charge of building it, and we build it from what we call food. Well, of course, the stuff we eat today has got absolutely no relationship whatsoever to what it used to be built from. And the ancient traditions do talk about this. They talk about returning to a sort of natural diet, and some traditions are even more explicit. You know, the sort of Judaic-Christian tradition, the sort of Genesis story, which is quite possibly a much older story, is quite specific. You know, it talks about fruit and leaves. Quite astounding when you think that modern science effectively concurs with that, at least in terms of our evolutionary origins. So I think we have a big piece of the jigsaw there. Then you look at some of these other practices, which again I'm calling treatments. They seem to fall into two camps, surprise, surprise. One bunch of treatments are about trying to inhibit the effects of the left hemisphere. So sort of the Trappist tradition, not speaking, because left hemisphere is speech dominant, the kind of meditative approaches and so on and so forth, and even reducing sleep. Is a simple idea. If we have two consciousness systems, one's very inefficient but in charge, and it's got weak batteries, and it needs to recharge very regular or it loses control. Okay, so you starve it of its recharge time, and yes, it doesn't like it, and you feel terrible, and you're grumpy, and you're irritable, and you become dysfunctional. But if you stay with that long enough, its ability to stay in control begins to slip away. Okay, so a whole bunch of techniques there to limit the effects of the side of our brain that isn't working too well, and hand in hand with that, techniques that can stimulate and re-engage the latent ability in the right hemisphere. So effectively our sense of self begins to migrate from, if you see the hemispheres or each side of the brain as a kind of musical instrument, and our sense of self is the music. Currently we're playing through a very distorted and damaged instrument. That's all we know. We think it's normal. But if you can manage to switch sides, and the music plays through an instrument that may not be perfect anymore, but it's in much better shape, oh my god, the sound is divine, or the experience is divine. Well, those traditions tell us an awful lot about how to approach this problem. Did they have a complete answer? Possibly not. But they give us a lot of clues, and I think putting all those in the same place and using them in combination, and then possibly on top of that using some of the technology we've created. I mean, most of our technology is insane and is highly self-destructive, or we use it to build weapons to kill each other and so on. But within that complete mayhem, there are bits of equipment and approaches that may give us an edge in terms of being able to manage this condition, treat it, and ultimately come up with a fix. So I think it could be done. It's whether there really is a condition. That's the question I'm asking. Then do we want to do anything about it? I mean, if it turns out a neural system's badly compromised and this isn't anybody's fault, is it remotely sane to go, okay, well, we just continue with that then? Or would the sane option be, hang on a minute, if we've got phenomenal capacity locked away, and even our ideas of phenomenal capacity, even our ideas of advanced and so on, are up for question because they've all come out of our rational mind. Our rational mind has all sorts of ideas about what humans are. I mean, even the very label human beings, we live in a world of labels, concepts, and what we should be. There may be a piece of equipment inside of us that can experientially tell us who and what we are, at least a lot more accurately than we currently have. And all these traditions say that, and people still have these experiences. So is it possible to put a formula together that can at least shift us into a state where we have a bit more access, we're a bit more sane or a bit less insane? That to me would be a good starting point. I mean, I certainly wouldn't, even if the proposal I put forward turns out to be somewhere near the mark, at this stage I'd say the sensible thing to do isn't to rush ahead and come up with finite conclusions. Say, how can we access more function? Then we might figure out the right questions to ask, and let alone come up with the answers. That to me makes sense. So that's where I think we can start, bootstrapping ourselves a step at a time, doing a rebuild, putting in place the practices that can give us more access to equipment that works better and has a much higher cognitive function, much more intelligent, much more aware, and begin then asking the questions and, of course, trying to come up with answers. At this stage, I'm really just interested, are we in the middle of a huge train wreck? And, of course, that train wreck is us. Is it possible to put the brakes on before it's too late? That's all I'm interested in at this stage. The idea that there's complete answers, I think, would be far too premature. But I'm certainly convinced we have enough latent capacity to begin putting ourselves back on track, to begin asking the right questions, and to begin coming up with solutions. The kind of capacity that we see in prodigious geniuses, savants, and so on, I think that's locked away in pretty much all of us. And I think it might be quite simple, relatively speaking, to begin accessing that. And that's where I think we can start reversing the decline by having the insights, coming up with appropriate questions, and coming up with answers beyond the wildest capability of our so-called advanced rational mind. It wouldn't come up with anything novel and new. It just thinks more of the same is a good idea.
Yeah. Do you see that some individuals being, sort of speaking, so far gone that they just can't grasp anything more than what their rational or irrational left brain is telling them?
Yes, I think at one extreme that is very real, and ironically, I think there's a correlation between the condition that exhibits itself in that, or the symptoms in that sort of the way it exhibits in that way, tend to be people who are most frightened and most driven to take control. So we've ended up with society and civilization increasingly built on a hierarchy of madness. I think I'm generalizing a little bit, but I also think it's pretty obvious to a lot of people. And I'm talking about people who really want to be in control. I'm not talking about people who are brilliant at what they do and end up in control. That's a different matter altogether, mostly anyway. But yes, I think we've ended up, our society and culture has been guided by some of the most deluded and dysfunctional people around. And I think when you're so dominated by such a limited perspective, and of course, this isn't anybody's fault, but by definition, people are blind to anything else because the equipment cannot see anything else. It's not that they're being bloody minded necessarily. It's like they've got a black and white TV and you're on the phone saying, hey, can can you see how amazing the colors are? And they're looking at the TV and going, what you want about? I can't see anything. It's that simple. They cannot see it. But I think it's possible to lay out enough rationally understandable. It's got to be in the language of the left brain. It's got to be concepts rather than experience. So if you can, metaphorically speaking, if you can take an X-ray to somebody or something like that and say, look, here's the damage in this part of your brain, can you see it? If it's that simple, and they go, well, I can't, I feel fine, but they see the damage. Or maybe a better analogy, one I've used before, if the patient is in a hospital and they're recovering from serious injury, but they have no idea they've got serious injury because the injury is to their brain, and they're convinced they're absolutely fine, which cases like that do exist. In fact, that's part of what the left hemisphere does, in a milder way. But if you can then get that person to sit down and watch CCTV footage of their car crashing into a concrete pillar and then being taken out by the paramedics, and they can clearly see it's them, if you can provide some kind of mechanism like that where it becomes obvious even though they can't feel anything, there's a possibility then, I think, of challenging the rational mind's absolute belief that everything's fine. Maybe it's not possible, but that's what I think is possible. And I've certainly seen that in microcosm, where I've just pointed people to existing data, because I haven't done this research. I'm just one of the things that I say a lot is I'm making a pretty bold claim here. I'm saying humans have got a serious neurological condition, very serious, and it's resulted in severe perceptual problems. Now, if that really is the case, there would have to be a mountain of evidence. We'd be swimming in the evidence. We just wouldn't have seen it because we've got the condition. However, once you keep making that point and encourage people to start asking that question, or in the tradition of debating, let's imagine for a minute we've all got serious brain damage. What would the world look like? How would our relationships be? What would we be doing? And then it becomes much less of a leap. It becomes quite uncomfortable very immediately. It's like, oh my God, this is exactly how we'd behave if one half of our brain was toast and it was running the show. It's that simple. But that's not what we've been brought up to ask. And of course, it's uncomfortable for some people to ask. But I think if you lay it out like that and you present the modern neurological literature that's really good, I think the literature is very good. The conclusions, of course, by definition must be suspect. But where you have information, you have data. Again, I'm looking again at the left brain, and the accepted evidence is it lies, it's deluded, it cannot perceive reality. Oh, and by the way, it's in charge. If we were remotely sane, we'd all stop immediately and go, holy shit, there's something wrong here. And the evidence is there. It's staring us in the bloody face. But of course, we're using the same piece of equipment, looking at the evidence going, oh yeah, it's fine because this is specialized adaptation and everything's cool. No way. I don't know if that makes sense. It makes sense to me, but I'm probably as deluded as everyone else. So.
Yeah, it definitely makes sense to me.
But I think that's an interesting game to play. And again, there should be no fear in asking these questions. If we're sane and everything's functional, we should be very happy to check in, ask these questions, give ourselves a clean bill of health. But we should be willing to ask the questions. So it shouldn't be a problem at all to, imagine. Well, let's imagine what it would be like. How would we experience ourselves and each other, and what kind of world would we live in if our left hemisphere was badly damaged and in charge? What would it look like? And that there should be no challenge in that at all. There should be no evidence in the neurological literature. There should be no missing ecology from the forest, something I make clear in the book. There would be no traditions, universal traditions, that humans were going stark raving bonkers. Now, individually, you might be able to explain away any one of these pieces of the jigsaw, but the very fact they all exist and they're all telling us the same story, and also telling us that we're going to find it hard to see it and experience it, that's pretty damn weird that exists. I mean, is it proof? Possibly not. but my God, it's damn weird that it exists.
Yes, definitely it is. Have you seen it increasingly getting picked up by the academics that they're incorporating this data into their own area of expertise, like neurochemistry or anthropology or primatology and so forth?
Not yet. I'd say it's early days. What I did do, well, I've done it at different stages, but once the sort of manuscript was done, and in many ways I'd love to rewrite the whole manuscript because there's so much new information, but it's not that I feel the original manuscript's flawed in any way. I could just provide so much more data, but even that original outline I'm pretty happy with. And of course I wanted to test the water. I wanted to send copies to people to see if it, see what reaction I got. And obviously, bearing in mind I must have this condition. Of course I have this condition. I could have been off on some complete tangent and completely insane. So I sent copies and various summaries to different people. And it struck me quite early on, I didn't need to send it to hundreds of people because the proposal I made so extreme relative to what most people expect, and the mechanisms are quite simple if you have a background in the appropriate sciences. I really only needed a bit of feedback from a number of people in different disciplines. That was all, and that initial feedback has been phenomenally good, way better than I expected. I was hoping that maybe some respected academics might say, okay, well, it's a bit unusual, but it might be worth looking at. I've had responses that again, for academics, they're usually conservative, kind of almost eulogies going along the lines of wow, this is phenomenal, this could turn everything upside down. So that was enough to tell me that being able to perceive the information as evidence that we're highly advanced, or the same information can be perceived as we're highly degenerate, the fact a few other people agree with that possibility, that was enough. I thought, well, okay, I'm not completely crazy here, or all crazy, of course, but it makes sense. So really those initial responses again provided me with a lot of drive and impetus to keep going with this. Of course, the next stage, which is what I hope is going on at the moment, is to reach a much wider audience and really initiate debate. There's no way humanity can have a severe neurological condition, and once we start focusing on that question, it will not be possible to escape from that conclusion unless it doesn't exist. Of course, people will have hostile responses. I mean, most of the hostile responses I get are from people who've either not read the book or can't be bothered to look at the material and so on. They just go, this is a crazy idea because it's not the accepted idea, which of course it wouldn't be. Anybody who's actually bothered to look at the book and done a bit of reading around and looked at some of the extra information, that's when it starts to get interesting, because it suddenly isn't so easy to go, oh, this is some kind of bullshit crazy idea. It's like, oh my God, actually this does start to make sense. So that's all I'm really trying to do at this stage, is initiate debate, but serious debate. And again, if anybody wants to dismiss a new theory, to do it justice, they have to understand it. Of course, a lot of people don't bother to try and understand it. They just dismiss it at a very superficial level. But if you bother to at least attempt to make the theory work, and there should be no risk in that, and then come away and go, well, it's complete rubbish because of this, and this, absolutely fine, that's what I'm looking for. But for the most part, I'd say the majority of reaction for people who've bothered to read it, understand it, is incredibly positive. It's like, oh my God, this makes so much sense. And of course it's so obvious. It's been staring us in the face forever, as it would have had to have been. It's not something that would have, we couldn't have got to this point with a serious condition without there being a debris trail going back hundreds and thousands of years, whether it's our collective behavior. Well, hey ho, anybody who tries to claim that humans are remotely sane, I'm not interested anymore, and if that's pig-headed, I don't care. We're doing a damnedest to destroy ourselves and where we live. Clearly insane. So our collective behavior is an absolute no-brainer. And then, as I say, we have all these traditions in all various formats, and they all pretty much talk about humanity sliding into primitive behavior, delusion. Well, we all understand the word delusion, but how do we know if we're deluded? Really simple stuff.
Yeah.
And then are there mechanisms? Is there a smoking gun here? Well, the orthodox science supports the idea of an incredibly unique origin, incredibly unique, and it's echoed in these ancient traditions. And the incredibly unique origin was a symbiotic relationship with the reproductive organs of a whole other kingdom. Okay, that's what we formed a symbiotic relationship with. Now, I know enough about plant sciences, and I don't know a huge amount. I know enough that that's an incredibly unique symbiotic relationship. We're ingesting the sex organs of a whole other kingdom, and those sex organs are loaded with all sorts of complex biochemistry and hormonally active compounds that evolved to read DNA differently. That's enough for me. It's enough to go, there's something worth looking at here. Of course we can pick it apart. Of course we can look at it and go, well, actually maybe it doesn't fit. But there's enough of a smoking gun that points to me very powerfully in the direction that really our first priority here should be to give ourselves a clean bill of health. Well, a lot of people are worried about what on earth's going on and the massive damage we're doing and etc., etc. That isn't going to change if we've got a problem in our neural system, and we should be able to figure that out. We should be able to stop and go, okay, is there a problem with our consciousness system, our neural system? If there isn't, fine. We've got to look at our behavior in another way. If there is a problem, that's surely got to be our absolute priority, because everything else is going to go to shit.
Yeah, for sure. Have you looked at the possibility that perhaps our lineage wasn't the last one to break apart from the fruit symbiosis, and maybe there was some lineages that went on even further and maybe became even more advanced but have died out long time ago?
I suppose it's possible, but I'm not aware of any evidence that would support that. In principle, it could be possible. I suspect, and I don't mean this in an arrogant way, the evidence will emerge or it won't, but I suspect what we call ourselves humans, and I suspect it was a gradation of speciation rather than the distinct lineages we normally talk about. I think we basically, in a very literal and metaphorical way, there was a hothouse effect in the forest, where the plant biochemistry was having a massive impact on the way we developed and the structures we evolved and so on, just because of the complex biochemistry. And all the while there were refugees, if you like, lineages that were isolated from the forest, became separated, and they evolved in the wrong way. But I suspect there was a final sort of shrinking of the forests and whatever lineages were left. And it may just have been humans, possibly Neanderthals at a slightly earlier stage. It looks to me like they were the last two out of the forest. And by when I say out of the forest, I mean breaking that symbiotic relationship. Because, of course, some primates still live in the forest. We've got the great apes, the gorillas, the chimpanzees, the bonobos, the orangutans. It's not necessarily about staying in the forest. It's about this symbiotic relationship breaking down. If it breaks down, that's when the problems start. If the forest recovers and the obligate tree dwellers, the primates that are still more adapted to tree living, recolonize the forest, maybe they survived in gallery forest along the rivers and so on, that's not enough to start this mechanism again. So once it breaks down, that's it, it's broken down. Putting the forest back, eating fruit again, it will slow things down, it will help, but it will not start that process again. So I come back to the point earlier. I think the smoking gun for me at the moment is the evidence from the fossil record, and of course it's limited, it's not complete, and forests or tropical forests are incredibly bad at leaving fossils. But I think the smoking gun is this accelerating curve when our neocortex in particular was expanding at a phenomenal rate, and it's very expensive to build, very expensive to run, and to survive. Quite clearly, the fossil record tells us, or the species we see today, we do not need a huge neural system to survive. It's got nothing to do with survival. Something else was going on there. But I think that window when that expansion stopped, I think that's the clue. And humans certainly seem to fit that bill as possibly being the last of that lineage coming out of there. But yes, there could have been others, and we've yet to find evidence of them. That is possible.
Right, there's no telling how much we are missing, because it's like when they first discovered the piece of bone finger from a Denisovan, and that started the whole new area of discussion on that, and this day they still don't have any idea what exactly, how do they look like, how do their faces formed, and all they know is what from that bone discovery, and so far that they've habited anywhere from Siberia up to Southeast Asia for huge areas. And yeah, there's so much we don't know.
Well, I agree. Particularly when it comes to the fossil record, it's in many ways a very weak link. But so far, it doesn't contradict the idea. As I say, that this particular weak area is if our origins or this very unique symbiotic relationship, the only place that can occur is the non-seasonal tropical forest. Not even the seasonal tropical forest, that wouldn't sustain it. The only place you can get fruit 24/7 for millions of years is a non-seasonal tropical forest. By definition, it's wet. And whether we've looked there, but also by its very nature, fossils aren't very easily preserved there or made there. So I think the fossil record is weak. But I'm looking at the whole picture, and if you lay all the pieces out, that there is this pattern there. It's like, okay, any individual piece has maybe 20 explanations. Put two pieces together, the number of explanations starts to drop. If you put them all in the same place, it starts to look quite compelling. There's something going on here, and it's quite challenging. It's back to this idea that the real problem we have is between our ears. And all these ancient traditions said that, and some of them were very, they came from a very sort of wise perspective, and they certainly didn't make the kind of mess we're making now. And it seems to be, I'd invite anybody and everybody, including skeptical academics, to revisit the standard left-right brain literature. Forget the current conclusions, just look at the evidence, look at the data, and what the hemispheres individually, what they contribute. That's all. Now, it's not the whole picture, but it's shocking. If you step back and look at that with eyes fresh, without the current thinking, and as I say, that should be enough to alarm us. The perceptually dominant piece of equipment for all of us has some incredibly bizarre characteristics, and they seem to fit very much with this idea of sociopathic, psychopathic, paranoid, frightened, need to be in control, very limited function, pretty stupid, etc., etc. We all have this. I have this. It's not very comfortable, but if that's what's really going on, then we need to embrace that. We need to accept that and start informing our decisions based on the fact that we might have a serious problem between our ears, and trying to look for solutions out there isn't going to cut it.
Yeah, definitely. Do you see that as more of just an accident sort of thing that happened that prompted the first arrival and rise of civilizations that were patriarchal and hierarchical, that there was just a group of people getting together who had more dysfunction and just started growing and growing in numbers, and eventually becoming large enough that they just, whenever they encountered the more old style egalitarian tribes and societies, that they just wiped them out of fear then?
I think that's been a factor, but I think that's generally much more recent. But yes, I think once you're on a roll, once the least functional members of society, I see the emergence of patriarchy and hierarchical systems as a symptom of this neurodegeneration. It's neurological damage expressing itself in the real world. And that's quite a challenging thing to say. But one of the key players in this theory is testosterone, which is primarily but not exclusively a male hormone, and it plays a significant role in this theory. So I would expect males to exhibit more extreme symptoms, and the worst end of that spectrum, you get the most sociopathic, psychopathic control freaks. And by definition, they want to be in charge. They're the people who should never be in charge, but they always are in charge. And once they're in charge in shaping the world in their own image, of course, you then get not only you sort of get a process of the condition accelerating its own demise, where everybody else gets pulled into systems of being that exacerbate the condition. And in addition, and as you point out, almost certainly because of so much fear and need for control, anything that doesn't fit that very limited perspective is seen as a threat and is usually destroyed. And we're surrounded by even our recent history. I was born and grew up in the UK, so I'm labelled as British or English or whatever. Well, you look at what the English did in recorded history. Oh my God. It's shockingly horrifying what we were responsible for in terms of absolutely trashing God knows what we could get our hands on. But it's not unique, of course. It's happened all over the place. And yeah, the lowest common denominator, fear and control, usually wins out. That's accelerated this process where the last relics and traditions that certainly I don't think we're free from this condition. I don't think there's a tribe or a culture that doesn't have a tradition of their ancestors being in much better shape than they were. But nevertheless, where they've tried to keep alive traditions that allow access, so the living traditions of plant medicine, or the living traditions where a lot of time was devoted to encouraging access to the right hemisphere is a very essential thing to do. When those cultures meet much more domineering cultures, the result's pretty much always the same. It's carnage, and that stuff gets wiped out. So it's kind of accelerated this process. I don't see it as the cause at all. As I said, I think the emergence of these states of mind, patriarchy, male dominance, and so on, that in itself is a symptom of neurological degeneration. And I can just about get away with that being a male myself. But I think that pretty much is the case. And you look around today, the mess we're in, it's massively male dominated.
Yeah, and that's how we've viewed our whole history, that it's the sexist male thinking that males are the superior dominant, and they apply every theory according to that.
Yeah, well, I think it's a classic symptom of left brain dominance. And again, I've said this already, I'll say it again. I invite anybody listening to this to go online, go into Google, and just start looking up some of the left-right brain literature. And if you do that with an open mind and you look at the traits of the so-called advanced, specialized left hemisphere, never mind the interpretation, by definition that must be suspect. Delusion, denial, it's frightened, it needs to be in control, it's pretty stupid, etc., etc. If that's in charge, and remember this isn't anybody's fault, but if that's in charge, what kind of world is it going to create? Let me think. Oh, I know, just look out the window.
Yeah, exactly.
And whatever people think of the theory, I don't think I'm imagining that, because everybody I bump into sees exactly the same thing. Absolute fucking insanity, for real, not metaphorical, not poetical, clinical insanity.
Yeah.
And what's one of the first things you check out if you're a patient in the consultant's room, you're displaying symptoms of dementia, clinical insanity? Do you even bother looking at the structure and neurochemistry of the brain? Is that one possible cause? Hell yes, it's one possible cause. Is there any evidence in the literature? Hell yes, it's everywhere you look. Is there, and so on and so on. I don't think there's no rocket science to this. I think all I'm trying to do is put this in a language that's stupid enough for my left brain to understand. That was my first task, and it's pretty stupid. And then, can anybody else understand this? It's not going to be lack of evidence. There'll be overwhelming evidence. I won't have any problem at all with evidence. It's how I can get people to ask the right questions. That's all.
Yes, for sure. It doesn't really make much sense that we've developed this huge infatuation into making our diet of, for example, a bunch of different grass seeds, and then
yeah, highly processed grass seed, and microwave baked, boiled, baked again, and then we build the most complex neural system we know out of it. Oh yeah, that's a really good idea. I mean, basic engineering. That's I know, I say this in other talks, but it is like going to NASA and saying, look, I can save you guys some money. I'm going to build a space shuttle out of plywood, and I've got a couple of engines out of an old Skoda, and it's going to look very similar. It'll be the same,
Yeah.
That's what we've done with the most complex neural system in the world. And anybody, and I don't care what academic tradition they're from, anybody who thinks that isn't going to make a colossal difference is already absolutely bonkers.
Yeah.
And I stand by that. I will stand by that come hell or high water. Anybody who thinks that you can build the most complex neural system we know from utter garbage, shit, junk, and it's not going to have a massive impact is insane. End of story. And there's many pieces of the jigsaw that are that solid. It's basic engineering. No possible way at all.
Yeah.
You wouldn't, I use a space shuttle. Like I said, another example. If you were waiting in line to board a 747 and there was a whisper, a rumor that during maintenance somebody had dropped the flight management computer, but it was fine. They shoved it back in and it's all working. Nobody would get on the plane, including the pilots. It would be grounded immediately. So how much evidence do we need? How much doubt do I need to create before we immediately stop, put on the brakes and go, oh my God, there's a 1% chance our neural system's damaged? That should be enough. 1% evidence that we're mentally ill. Of course, if we're already seriously mentally ill, it's probably going to take 80-90%. That's the paradox. There's no lack of evidence here, as far as I'm concerned. It's everywhere you look. You just have to start looking, and then it can be quite scary.
Yeah.
I mean, we're talking about the macro effects, our propensity for war and defense contracts and building machines designed to kill millions of people, and we killed 100 million of our own kind, all that kind of stuff, which is in the book and I cover. But just bringing it back down to our own individual experience and who and what we think we are and so on. And this is a question I ask quite regularly now at talks and so on. And again, classic symptom, but I ask basically how many people in any given audience, or ask them whether they have an incessant chattering voice in their head. And of course this is not new, this is written about, but I'm talking about numbers here. How many people in your typical audience has an incessant chattering voice in their head going on about all sorts of stuff that they would probably not dare share with their partner, their husband or their wife? Some of it's so weird and bizarre or embarrassing or crazy or whatever. Now, most of us don't want to own up to that, but in a group, and I'm the first one to put my hand up, 99% of people put their hands up.
Yeah.
Now that alone should be enough. Forget all the other stuff. There's so many pieces here where we should be going, holy shit, okay, what's going on here?
Yeah.
The fact that we don't, to me, is more evidence that the condition's incredibly serious.
Yeah.
That's the paradox. It's to me it is like, I've been talking a bit about this recently in different interviews and stuff, that I kind of see the ancient traditions, this sort of spiritual oral traditions, and then their sort of distillation into the more rationalized belief versions of those ancient traditions. It reads like a dementia diary. You know, we have these ancient ideas of, you know, the traditions don't talk about, oh, things were a bit better and most people were fine. They talk about something wholly other, and you know, the pun is intended, wholly other. And they talk about divine rapture. Now, these are words, aren't they? Divine. What does divine rapture mean? What does it feel like to be in divine rapture all the time? So those are the kind of things they talk about. And then we go through this process and we end up here. Of course, what we need to factor in is we're on the last page of the dementia diary, and we can't even understand the early entrants because it's in a language we can't comprehend anymore. What we can comprehend is recorded history, rationalized accounts, and we think that's advanced. But we would if we got dementia. We've got it back to front.
Yeah.
I'm starting to rant now. My own dementia's getting a hold of me. So.
Whole issue that also a left-brainer would then brought up that how come our ancestors, why wouldn't they just seek another tropical forest perhaps? Why would they keep migrating as time passes, more and more hostile and colder environments, instead of trying to deal with the issue at hand if they were much more functional tens and hundreds of thousands of years ago?
Well, again, it's a good question, but I think it's an incredibly insidious condition. You know, it's screws and cogs coming loose in the very equipment that we use to assess who we are and how do we come up with solutions. However, I think that there was a period, and again, we have these clues where there was a phenomenal effort, and I think some of the approaches that were developed were amazing. They weren't enough to completely stop this thing in its tracks. And I think, you know, once, again, a harsh example, but once you start moving into a form of dementia, your actions and your decisions become less and less coherent. You know, when you've got mild mental health problems, for the most part, you're aware you've got mild mental health problems, and you try to be proactive, you try to manage it, you try to take treatments and so on. However, as that condition progresses, you know, the first thing you do in the classic sense is stop taking the pills. And you start wandering into places that are very dangerous and start doing incredibly crazy things. So, of course, as the condition progresses, yes, we've just ended up exacerbating the situation. We managed to survive. Again, this isn't necessarily about survival. We came out of the forest with a phenomenal piece of kit. And it's allowed us to survive and invent all sorts of technologies to survive. All the while we've been sliding further and further into delusion. So it's no surprise to me we've ended up in the most godforsaken places, eking out a terrible living in harsh environments. You know, that's, again, if you had 100 people in a room and they had dementia and you let them out, what would they do? Would they look after themselves? Would they do the absolute best for themselves? Mm-hmm. Well, they'd probably hurt themselves. They'd hurt each other. Hey ho, what are we doing?
Right.
You know,
right.
Classic symptom of mental ill health is what? Self-harm.
Yeah.
Self-harm. As a species, we're hurting ourselves. You know, we've got all these crazy ideas about these artificial boundaries and racism. As a singular species, and even that's an arbitrary term, but let's go with that, all we're really doing is hurting ourselves and destroying the place we live. That's all. And that's what people with serious mental health problems do. They hurt themselves. And that's what we're doing, and that's incredibly sad and incredibly painful.
Yeah. How's it coming along, or have you been able to find potential investors or finances to get along with the documentary series, perhaps?
Not as yet. I mean, I've had little bits of help along the way, and it's been incredibly important. You know, for years, just trying to stay afloat and get these ideas together was an incredible challenge. And I've certainly tried at different times to almost get ahead of myself, because I could see 20 years ago where this might end up, and so far it's on track. It's just taken a lot longer than I'd hoped. And yeah, there is interest developing, but I think it's really, the real test is going to come if the basic ideas and questions, is our neural system remotely functional, etc., etc. If that can get to a wider audience, that's, I think, when there's a chance for some real action. At the moment, it's still in that early launch phase. The classic analogy of trying to build a spaceship in your garden shed with bits borrowed and begged and stolen and whatever. And I'm not saying I built a spaceship. I think I've got something that's, it might fly, it might not, but it's ready to launch whatever it is. And for sure, if there's any truth in this, I'm going to need a lot of help. In fact, it's not really about what I do; it's about what we all do. If collectively, and of course it's still an if, and of course I expect people to challenge it, and I hope they do. If there's a problem with our neural system, our consciousness system, it's all our responsibilities. We're all responsible for our state of mind. And if we choose to not ask the questions, or we choose to do nothing about it, that's up to us. We can continue on the road we're going on. That is our choice. Or we can choose to do something else. All I'm trying to do is get the questions out there. What we do with the information, what anybody else does with the information, I have no control over that. I just want to try and draw attention to something that I think is very important. And where I get excited is that if it all comes down to a problem between our ears, yes, it's challenging. It's we don't want to look in the mirror and go, oh, actually, I'm fucking crazy. None of us want to do that. But if that is the truth, and all our ancestors thought that, and our current behavior supports that, etc., etc., to me, that's an exciting challenge because it's human scale. I'd much rather face up to the idea, okay, we've got to figure out how to fix our brain or fix our state of mind, rather than how on earth do we fix global deforestation, global war, global this, that's run away from us now. I think we don't even know what to do about that. It's overwhelming. But the evidence is phenomenally compelling that, the common factor in all the problems we face, obviously, although it's not always obvious till you think about it, is our collective state of mind. There isn't a decision made to build a machine, to do this, to do that, without a human decision. In other words, our state of mind. And our state of mind is incredibly closely correlated. They're effectively the same, but I'll say, of course, they're not. They're effectively the same. The structure and neurochemical regime of our neural system gives us our state of mind. Now, I know they're not the same, and I'm not saying that, but we might as well say they're the same. Okay? So if it's as simple as correcting the structure, and we already know that changing the structure on a minute scale, tiny amounts of neural structural change, tiny amounts of neurochemical change have a massive impact on our state of mind. So if that's got terribly out of kilter, if that's where the problem is, it's a much easier challenge to figure out, well, what is the neurochemical regime? What is the neurological structure that creates a sane sense of mind, a sane state of mind? That's a much easier challenge to me. And we already know an awful lot. We actually know an awful lot. For example, we know an awful lot how we can change our neurological regime, which, remember, we do it every day. Our current state of mind is a product of our current neurological regime. Yeah? Pretty simple. Yeah. We can choose to defend that, and if that's as good as it ever got, fine, okay. But we know we left the forest. We know we left behind the most complex molecular ecology we know of. That's no longer coursing through our neural system when it's developing and growing and so on and so forth. So moving on from that, and just crude examples, we know a lot about how to feel miles better than we do right now. And often there is legislation and prohibition that tells us that some of these approaches work. We can feel better right now by tweaking the environment. Now, that may not be a whole solution, but why on earth are we defending feeling shit, frightened, scared, stressed, when we could feel not just a little bit better, but phenomenally better? And how would we behave towards each other and the planet we lived on if we felt phenomenally better all the time?
Right.
and that's not exactly light years away. That's not some kind of science fiction future. That already exists. We know a lot about, how to eat so much better. In other words, how to construct our cells and our neural system from much better quality materials. We know that our current neurochemical regime produces our current state of mind. We know how to shift that in a direction of feeling much better, having much more empathy, having much more compassion, not being so frightened, etc. We know. We have a lot of partial answers to that. Why is that not our urgent priority? Yes, because it's a circular problem. It's back to that catch-22.
Yeah.
But if these things can be laid out in an incredibly simple way, I mean, one of the things I'm interested in is if it's possible to lay out a simple diagnosis that the rational mind can understand, and all right, the conclusion is challenging. It's the left rational mind that is actually the most damaged, and we know it's very frightened. The classic ego rational mind. One of the things it really has trouble with is not being seen to be clever. It likes to be very clever. It always likes to be, I'm the best, I'm the cleverest, blah, blah, blah. It's possible, I think, to create a bit of a sort of, bit of a Trojan horse, a bit of a trap, where you create a scenario where the really clever thing to do is own up to the fact that there's a problem. Because if you're the one standing up and saying there's no problem here, you're the one that's going to look really fucking stupid.
Yeah.
And that the egotistical mind does not want to be seen to be stupid. Yes, it wants to be in control. It loves being in control. What it likes even more is to be seen to be clever. So I'm hoping that if this stands up to scrutiny, and I'm sure there's lots of refinement and things that need to be looked into, if it stands up to scrutiny, it's possible to roll out a Trojan horse whereby anybody who wants to hang on to the status quo is going to look really fucking stupid.
Yeah.
And the egotistical, the rational mind absolutely hates that. It might grudgingly slink off into the corner grumbling and moaning, but it will not want to be the one standing up going, no, fuck it, we're going to keep everything the same, everything's fine. Well, that's fine when you're surrounded by equally stupid people doing the same thing. But if you've got a building case that actually that's the stupidest thing you could ever say, and more people can see that, it's the emperor's new clothes. Who wants to be stood there with everybody pointing going, you're the stupidest person in the room? Nuh-uh. So I'm hoping there's a kind of psychological twist to this where it becomes just too uncomfortable to be the stupid idiot going, yeah, more of the same, and let's legislate and keep our state of mind exactly the same even though we're about to fly off the cliff and destroy ourselves. No, unfortunately that's really stupid. It isn't your fault. It's not your fault. It's okay. But it's really stupid,
Yeah.
I don't know. Maybe it's not possible, but that's kind of my current drive at the minute, is to just get the ideas out there in a simple format and see if ideas can spread, and we end up recognizing the fact that we're all in this. We've all got this.
Yeah.
And yes, some people display the symptoms a bit more, a bit less. Nobody's fault. What are we going to do with this? Do we want the least functional people in charge? Probably not a good idea. Do the least functional people want to try and stay in charge when it's going to make them look complete idiots? Possibly not. I mean, a lot of people who are really wanting to be in control, it's because they're very frightened. They actually want an easy way out if they can find one. They're hanging on because they're terrified, hanging on to power and control. Well, if you can provide an easy out that's backed up by rational science, remember the demented language of modern rational science, reductionism is seen as some wonderful tool. It's actually a massive failure in being able to see the whole picture. Never mind, if it's in the appropriate language, who's going to stand up and say, no, I still want to stay in control? You just make it so uncomfortable that it's, there might be some exceptions, but I think there's scope to create a scenario where even the most rabid control freaks would start to feel too uncomfortable being the most rabid control freaks. At the moment, it's almost seen as kind of, that classic Darwinian competition thing, which obviously takes Darwin's work a little bit out of context. Being the most aggressive, being the most competitive is a good thing. But if that can be turned around and the evidence supports it, it's the most stupid thing. It's not such a cool thing anymore, And we kind of all instinctively know this anyway. It's not like we don't already know there's serious problems and it's insane. But if you can back it up with appropriate language, i.e. back to the language of dementia, how do you speak in the language of dementia where it makes sense? And that's the hardest job of all, I think. It's not whether we're insane or not. There can't really be any debate about it. Once you ask the question, either there's a serious problem or there's not. Time will tell. If there's a serious problem, how do you communicate it when actually perceiving there's a problem is the biggest challenge? I hope that's made a little bit of sense.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me, at least.
Yeah, well, that's two of us anyway.
Yeah, it's the real challenge is, really you need to find the exact perfect words and language for each specific individual. You need to change the whole language for each individual oftentimes, so you can get through to them that they can understand that. That's really the tricky point.
I agree, and I certainly don't claim to be the best communicator. That's where I need help. I'm quite pleased that I feel like I've got this to a point where other people can understand it. So I'm hoping amongst those other people are some brilliant communicators who can take what is in essence a very old idea. This is nothing new in this. As I say, I feel all I've done is translate it into. I'm trying to get ahead of the condition itself. Mm-hmm. It's a waste of time talking opaque philosophy and mystical language. We need to get ahead of the condition and meet the condition in language it can see as it's heading towards it, like a big stop sign that it can actually understand. And that language, I think, is modern, rational, reductionist language. But I don't regard myself as particularly gifted in that. So I'm hoping people who have much better communication skills can transform it even further and look at different formulas, animation, film, opera, music. I don't care, anything that can express this in a way we can hear and, of course, hopefully begin to act upon.
Right.
Okay, anyway, thanks for those few questions, and it's been interesting.
For sure. And tell the people where can they get in contact with you and learn more about your work, if you want to leave.
Okay, well, currently the best place to start. If anybody wants to design me a nice website, the content on my websites I'm reasonably happy with, but they don't present too well. But if you go to leftinthedark.org.uk, there's some basic introductory material on there, and then there's a link to another site, beyond _belief, so beyond belief. There's a link on there, plus a YouTube channel. But yeah, go to leftinthedark.org.uk and then look for the links to other sites and YouTube channels and all the rest of it. And there's quite a lot of information on there. So yeah, that would be the first place to start.